St. Petersburg enjoys a renaissance at the start of the 21st century. Let's take a look at the city's first golden age, the great Florida land boom of the 1920s. It was in 1925 and 1926 that most of these wooden craftsman-style bungalows were built here in District 8's historic Kenwood. Recently designated as a National Historic District, the Kenwood neighborhood is purported to have the greatest concentration of bungalows in the state of Florida. Now being restored to their original classic elegance, these bungalows defined life in Florida with gracious front porches along brick streets. Standard amenities for these homes included hardwood floors, large windows to take advantage of year-round sea breezes, and fireplaces for the occasional cool evening. Here was the site of Nolan's, the city's first large-scale grocery store, now redeveloped as upscale urban-style lofts. Since most year-round residents lived in this area, it was no coincidence that St. Petersburg High School was constructed here. The housing growth in District 8 was spurred not only by affordable housing, but also by streetcars that carried people along Central Avenue from downtown to the beaches. Developers Charles Hall and Walter Fuller were instrumental in building much of what is today Central St. Petersburg.
Welcome to Restore America. Many of our stories are of houses that have experienced severe neglect and vandalism. Every now and then, though, we feature a home that was never grossly defaced, but had drifted from its original design and beauty. The restoration of these homes is not always on a grand scale, but the difference is often found in the details. Our first story in St. Petersburg's historic Kenwood neighborhood is just that type of restoration.
Historic Kenwood has 1,100 homes of various architectural styles and sizes. The neighborhood is quickly becoming one of the crown jewels in St. Petersburg, Florida, because 60% of the 1,100 homes have been restored.
Historic Kenwood is one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city of St. Petersburg. It was built up as a retirement community, and as that population aged, the homes fell into a little disrepair. It was built out primarily in the 1920s and 30s and is now enjoying a wonderful rebirth.
The main reason Historic Kenwood is experiencing such a rebirth is the dedication of the men and women who call it home. One of these people is Bob Jeffrey, who has lived in the neighborhood for 11 years. In that time, he's restored 9 of Historic Kenwood's houses. While many of those homes required major structural repair, his last house had its own challenges.
The house was in, I want to say, good shape, but it had a lot of deferred maintenance. Things just had never been touched for a long time. Really, the goal was to go back to a lot of the details and more accurately make the house representative of what it originally was.
The home is called Spiller's Oaks. It was built in 1926 by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Kent Spiller. Mrs. Spiller lived in the home until she passed away in 1973. Then, the home sat vacant for more than 20 years. A friend of Bob Jeffries bought the home in hopes of restoring it, but wasn't able to because of illness. That's when Bob stepped in. He purchased the home in 1995 and began the restoration. The home needed a new roof, and in his quest to make the home look as it did originally, Bob also replaced all of the copper flashing.
We put that back because it was important to the character of the house. And a lot of times, as people restore houses, they tend to think that, well, they can save a few dollars here and there by not putting the details back. But when you add up all the details that are removed, it has a big impact on the quality and character.
Much of Spiller's Oaks had been modernized over time, but Bob wanted it to look just as it did in the 1920s.
Probably in the 40s or 50s, Mrs. Spiller had enclosed the porch with jalousie windows. And part of that was also to put aluminum awnings on the front of the house and to paint the brick columns that were there. And basically, at that point, it really just removed all the character and charm of it. In restoring it, we ended up taking out the windows. We ended up opening the arches back up that had been flattened.
Bob stripped decades of paint off the brick columns on the porch, and true to his passion for details, he even cleaned and sealed the original Cuban tile floor. Inside, Bob was pleased to find that most of the interior was in good shape. He loved the original features of the home and set out to make everything look as good as new. That wouldn't be an easy task, though, with the built-in cabinets.
That was probably the nastiest project. Over years, the doors had disappeared, the hardware was gone, and at some point, someone had started to chemically strip the paint off of them. Unfortunately, they abandoned the project and just left it in really rough shape.
Bob also stripped the paint and replaced the damaged molding. He had new doors custom-made to fit the cabinets, and then finished the project by sanding and painting them to look like they did originally. The home's bathroom, on the other hand, was a different story.
The bathroom was sort of a disaster. There had been paneling placed up in it at one time, and one time I was trying to look behind it and pulled on the paneling, and with that there was a big cloud of dust and a kaboom, and the entire plaster wall came down. At that point, after cleaning up that mess, we ended up going back to subway tile, which is real period for the 1920s, rebuilding all the plaster walls and then tiling it in a motif very similar to what would have been done in the 20s.
The restoration of all 7 rooms in Spiller's Oaks took a full year. Bob gives credit for this and all of his other restoration projects to his family.
I would not be anything if it wasn't for my parents and my sister, a family of doers who have spent countless hours on every house I've ever had. It's nice because it's fun. It gives us the ability to work together, to socialize together, but it really is also difficult work sometimes, and the nice thing is I know I can always depend on them to help me.
Last year, Bob depended on his sister Lynn to help him restore 5 cottages in historic Kenwood. The cottages were built in the 1920s to allow tourists to winter in the Sunshine State. Not only did Bob reverse the fate of the 5 cottages, he's currently restoring a nearby apartment building. Slowly, meticulously, and by paying close attention to the details, Bob Jeffrey is a major reason St. Petersburg's historic Kenwood neighborhood is making a comeback.
Bob has been very significant in restoring our neighborhood. He is a former president of the Neighborhood Association, and he is what we call a serial restorer. Bob Jeffrey will leave a great legacy in our neighborhood due to his restoration efforts.
Our next story takes us to the beautiful city of St. Petersburg, Florida. One part of the city, the historic Kenwood neighborhood, especially captured our attention. There, 2 men bought a home sight unseen and led the community's efforts in restoration. Greg Tappan and Bill Young were looking for a home to restore in historic Kenwood, the neighborhood where Bill's mom, Kathy, lives. Greg and Bill were on a business trip when Bill's mother called and said she found the perfect house for them. But perfect certainly wasn't what Greg and Bill thought the first time they saw the home.
It was very rough. It was painted about 6 different colors outside. The porch was enclosed. Some of the windows were painted over. There was no kitchen. There was some vandalism evidence, and it looked very sad.
The first time we saw the house, it was somewhat in shambles. The walls were falling apart. There were a lot of holes all over the house. So the house was pretty rough the first time we saw it.
The home was built in 1922 in the bungalow style. Greg and Bill had just finished restoring another home in Arizona when they moved to St. Petersburg, so they knew what they were getting into with a restoration of this magnitude. But as experienced as they were, they went to someone who had even more experience, Bill's mom, Kathy. She had restored 12 homes. The trio began work on the home's multicolored exterior.
The biggest challenge with the exterior of the house was the paint job. It hadn't had a truly good paint job in a long time, and it had a lot of different colors going on outside and not a real color scheme. And along with the paint job, there was a lot of prep work, a lot of sanding off old and flaking paint, and a lot of replacing of small sections of rotten wood. We had rotten windowsills and rotten decorative elements that we replaced.
Greg and Bill also tore out the screens on the front porch, and when they removed the vinyl flooring from the porch, they discovered a wood floor that only required sanding and painting. Then they headed inside.
There were a lot of problems with our walls in this house. We had 2 rooms that had 8 or 9 layers of wallpaper, and when we stripped the wallpaper, there were places where the plaster was missing or came off with the wallpaper. So there was a lot of replastering where we went back over the original lath and replastered and tried to match the texture of the original walls.
The walls that weren't covered in wallpaper had incomplete paint jobs. Unfortunately, the fireplace had also been painted.
This fireplace, along with the rest of the walls in the front room, was painted peach and turquoise. You cannot take this paint off. You would have to use paint remover, and you have a gooey, sloppy mess. So there's this paint that looks like stone, and you spray paint the fireplace, and it looks as close to stone as you can get.
While Kathy was working on the fireplace, Greg restored the home's original built-in cabinets.
The hardware had all been painted, and a lot of the original knobs and drawer pulls were missing. It had been replaced sometime in the 60s or 70s, and we had one missing door in the dining room that we had to recreate. So we stripped the original hinges and replaced the hardware with more appropriate depression glass hardware and gave everything a fresh coat of paint and a lot of sanding and cleaning.
Most of the home had original elements that could be restored, but there was one room that had nothing left.
The kitchen was nothing but solid four walls with no work. It looked like somebody had come in and just stripped it down, except for a late 1970s stove. The good and the bad was that they had already gutted the kitchen for us, so all we really had to do was rebuild it from scratch.
So we put in a new kitchen, but we tried to keep it respectful of the original architecture, and we put in a very simple blonde maple cabinet and simple tile countertops and new appliances.
Greg and Bill, with Kathy's help, restored all 10 of the home's rooms in just 1 year. Now, you'd think this restoration story was over, but it's only just begun again. The two just bought the house next door and have started an even more difficult restoration. This house was built the same year as the home they just restored, 1922. It was originally a craftsman bungalow also, but was changed over the years. Greg and Bill have high hopes for their current project, but they have a lot to do.
The house next door was probably literally the worst property in Kenwood. It's got a lot of really nice features, and we wanted to see it done right and plan to do a full restoration on it.
Right now, just the beginning phases of trying to get some of the woodwork done, trying to fix the ceilings. It had a lot of rot on the inside, so we're finding ourselves having to strip it back to the lap and then redo the ceilings, the walls where there's any kind of damage.
It's safe to say that Greg and Bill have made one restoration expert proud.
I think Bill and Greg have been a very big boost for this community. I think when you get someone who takes pride in their house, the neighbors look and they see the difference, and I think it motivates them to get out there and, you know, make their house a little bit nicer.
I think this neighborhood's just on the cusp of greatness right now. If you drive through and take a look at some of the bungalows throughout the neighborhood and the historic features that these houses have, I think a lot of people appreciate it and want to live in a place like this, and hopefully we're a part of restoring the entire neighborhood for many years to come.
Oh, wow, check out that house.
Yeah, look at that one.
You think they would let us take a peek inside?
Yes, they will. The residents of historic Kenwood neighborhood in central St. Petersburg invite you to take a step back in time. See the insides and out of a historic neighborhood in transition through the renovations of these early 20th century style homes. Meet us at Seminole Park, located at 29th Street North and 3rd Avenue North, to tour, experience, and see why these folks couldn't imagine living anywhere else.
Welcome back to Good Day Tampa Bay. With interest rates so low, many people are building brand new homes.
But Russell Road shows us others prefer something more cozy and quaint.
They've turned an old house into a home in the historic Kenwood neighborhood near downtown St. Petersburg. Stephanie and Richard Ellman have spent the last few years remodeling their 1925 bungalow.
We went around and we looked at the other homes and said, well, you know, you kind of see what you can become, and kind of a wish. And we talked, and it was like, I'm not Bob Vila, this is not this old house. But we said, you know, maybe in 3-4 years, we'll be able to work hard and get our house to that point.
To the point now of being in this year's historic Kenwood Bungalow Fest. 15 homes to see on this year's tour, like this one. Chuck DeFore and John Peak had a small space to work in. 3 bedrooms and 1 bath in just 1,000 square feet. A lot of walls came down.
The labor of love, I really enjoy it. It's been my hobby for the last 8 years. Always coming up with new ideas. No holds barred, you know.
Nothing's ever finished.
No, well.
Finished enough, though, to show it off tomorrow. If you want to see this year's historic Kenwood Bungalow Fest, You'll need to start at Seminole Park. That's at 3rd Avenue North and 29th Street in St. Pete. Buy your tickets, get a map, and board the trolleys. You'll stop here at Steve and Carol Hess's place. The Kenwood neighborhood came to be in 1912. It's been called St. Pete's first middle-class suburb. Historic Kenwood has one of the state's highest concentrations of craftsman-style bungalows. Now, because we all moved away from the downtowns, historic Kenwood has had its problems. It's on its way back, though, thanks to people like the Hesses.
This was the original intent of Bungalow Fest, is to showcase the neighborhood and have people see where it's come, and because it was pretty bad 10 years ago.
Yeah, when we moved in, there was some bad houses here. You know, there was some problems with, you know, police problems, crime problems that have been cleared up quite a bit.
And historic Kenwood has cleaned up very well and ready for show at the Historic Kenwood Bungalow Fest tomorrow. This is Russell Rhodes for Good Day Tampa Bay.
And the Bungalow Fest runs from noon until 5 tomorrow in the Seminole Park area. That's at 3rd Avenue North and 29th Street in St. Petersburg. A lot of neat places.